And when you actually understand what Web3 truly stands for, then the adoption becomes much easier. So I think Canada has clearly some great potential there.
Hey guys, Flo here with Blockchain North at Collision, our first day here after the yacht party last night. I'm here with Yat Siu from Hong Kong. Why don't you introduce yourself actually?
My name is Yat. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. We're a company that has made over 450 investments in the Web3 space specifically, in the intersection of crypto and blockchain. And we're also the owners of Sandbox and a bunch of other companies like TinyTap. We're probably best known for having made early investments in companies like OpenSea, Axie Infinity, Decentraland, Wax, and a whole bunch of other ones. But really at this point, we consider ourselves a sort of Web3 ecosystem builder that is really trying to push forward true digital property rights.
That's quite impressive. The part about Axie Infinity and OpenSea, those are big names, of course, that many would recognize. When and how did you get involved in Web3 and blockchain?
Well, I had an intellectual interest in crypto, but really as a business, we really got into it with CryptoKitties in 2017. In fact, our studio in Vancouver called Fuel Powered was actually involved in helping build that. And it was really more of a science experiment, but then when it actually took off, we were like, wait a second, there's something here, we should need to know this better. And that's when we decided to go all in. And that's when we started making many of our pivotal investments. In 2018, that's when we got into the space very actively. Yeah. And if you may recall, 2018 was actually a really bad crypto winter. If people talk about this being a crypto winter, then that would have been the crypto ice age. And that's actually when we really doubled down in the space. And that's probably one of the reasons why we ended up building a portfolio the way that we did, because frankly, things weren't that expensive. And also we had to educate, because back then NFTs, which to us is the conduit of true digital property rights, was not something that people liked, because they're like, oh, this seems whimsical, this doesn't seem strong utility. It's like, what is this? In fact, many of the core crypto communities themselves thought it was just a joke, right? Which, by the way, is kind of interesting what's happening with ordinals in Bitcoin as well. It's exactly the same sentiments and feeling, where the hardcore Bitcoin community is like, ordinals, inscriptions, not sure about that. That seems, again, whimsical and seems something that doesn't make sense. It's creating higher gas fees, it's bad for trading and transactions. But it's enriching their culture, which is what we saw with NFTs on Ethereum.
Very, very interesting. And so during your talk just now at the Hong Kong Masterclass on the startups in the region, you mentioned something that caught my attention. You said that AI would be powering the development of Web3. By the way, correct me if I got this wrong or slightly wrong.
That's correct. First of all, AI generally will power everything forward, but one of the things you have to consider is that AI is, what is it? It's a digitally native product. It exists digitally, and it has a life that's digital. So in the current format, in a centralized system, AI could be switched off. But if you think about how does an AI become almost sovereign in its own way, if it lives on the blockchain. So there's a natural element where it feeds data, it actually will be powered by smart contracts in a way, it will have a mechanism in which it can stay, sort of effectively live forever. That's one mechanism. Because after all, when we launch any asset, any product, any service on chain, it lasts forever, the good and the bad, for instance, right? So that's the first point. But the second thing, also, is that AIs are going to be our agents. I don't mean just agents in terms of buying and shopping for us. They're also going to be independent agents inside games, like NPCs. 3.4 billion people in the world play games. And actually, one of the characters that they interact the most with isn't necessarily just with other players, it's with non-player characters. These non-player characters are going to all be AI-driven. That's obvious. But then you're going to transact with them. Well, what are you going to transact them with it? You're going to transact with crypto, right? They're not going to have a bank account. There's not going to be any KYC on their fiat, for instance. And so that, to us, is going to power and drive, essentially, sort of even more utility and more action in the whole Web3 blockchain space, we think.
That's truly fascinating, and I'll have to wrap my head around some of what you said after maybe watching the video a second time. So Animoca Brands has a growing and a diversified portfolio, over 450 investments in NFT projects, decentralized projects. When Animoca makes an investment, what are some of its key criteria?
The key criteria for us is about whether you believe in the shared network effect and whether you're basically truly building in Web3. So in other words, we look for founders that build on the ethos of basically creating something that can be almost like a common good, but we don't think of it as a common good as a charity. We think of it as essentially as what you're building has to benefit the network as a whole. So we're thinking everything that's in Web3 is like building a nation, building like an economy. So maybe the mental model is a little bit like, okay, so you build a shopping mall in this area. The shopping mall will do well, hopefully. But when you build the shopping mall, everything around the shopping mall will also flourish because you're bringing in traffic. But the shopping mall doesn't own that restaurant, or it doesn't own that cinema. Someone else owns it.
It's the platform.
But it's a platform. Well, it's actually the magnet. It creates this economy, right? Because you all get to share in that sort of benefit. The problem we see in Web 2 is that the benefit is controlled by whoever owns the platform. In other words, network effects don't get shared. Network effects basically get controlled. And that to us also stifles innovation, it stifles growth. I mean, think of what happens if Twitter doesn't like you, they remove you. If Apple doesn't like you, they remove you.
Amazon.
Amazon, Facebook, it doesn't, you name it,
Yeah.
right? They decide your fate, right? Whereas in the Web3 paradigm, we can now actually take the true economic sense of the true economic freedom that you have in the construction and the development of your rights in the digital space, right? That's how we see it. Now, that seems easier said than done because it means that the founder, outside of being a strong founder that has to have financial knowledge, that has to have technical knowledge, all that kind of stuff, which is already pretty challenging, has to then also have a, I think, philosophical and political perspective around this, which we also think has to be somewhat leaning pro-capitalist, for instance, because Web3 has a very strong capitalist incentive mechanism, because Web3 is about aligning incentives. How do you align incentives? Well, you align incentives through capital, and you have to spread them in a sort of fair manner. So these values to us is critical. It means the founders have to have a sense of justice. They have to have a sense of equity, which isn't something that we taught our entrepreneurs in the past, because we taught our entrepreneurs in the past to take as much as you can, to be greedy, to basically have a zero-sum end game, which is not the ethos of Web3. So I would say that's probably the biggest differentiator between a true Web3 founder versus any other kind of founder.
Yeah. And let's talk maybe briefly about Hong Kong. You talked about capitalism, and in the talk you also spoke about how Hong Kong has still a capitalist culture, despite, let's say, recent crises that pretty much everywhere around the world seems to be having right now.
Yes.
Do you see this as contrasting to other parts of the world?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
How does that, let's say, support the development of Web3?
So first of all,
kind of answered a little bit already.
yeah, but I think first of all, one of the struggles that we have in places like the US, which has a strong anti-capitalist slant, particularly with people under the age of 30. There was actually a study that showed that 60% of people under the age of 30 actually preferred socialism over capitalism. Whether they understood what it was, I wasn't sure, but it all has to do with this sort of sense of injustice, right? It's the whole thing when people say, oh, he's a billionaire, that's wrong. How's that even possible? This was not the America that I knew, but it's America that has became this way because capitalism hasn't worked for young Americans in the last 20 years. And some of it has to do with the fact that the systems, not just what happened with money and the printing of money and all that kind of stuff and inflation, but also with the fact that young Americans have become disillusioned with capitalism because it hasn't worked for them. And when you think about the people who did labor work, over the last 20 years, their actual, in real money terms, is probably worth less than what they would have earned 20 years ago. And that's a problem, right? Now, take that, for instance, in Asia, which is the opposite. Even though there's inequity, there's always going to be inequity in any kind of capitalist system. In Asia, many people had nothing in the last 30, 40 years. Look at South Korea, for instance. South Korea was one of the poorest nations in the world. In fact, its GDP per capita was lower than North Korea in the 70s, right? And today, it's the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world, right? And it did so because it embraced capitalism, it had a democratic framework, it had property rights, it had a legal framework, all these things. And you look what happened in China, and you look what happened in Southeast Asia, that all these places became more open, more capitalist, and they live better today than they did 20 years ago. So I would argue that the American dream is much more alive in Asia than it is in America, unless you're in pockets like Miami, Silicon Valley, possibly Los Angeles, those places. But the rest of America doesn't experience that. So that to me is sort of one of the narratives that has sort of why Asia is leading in this space. That's one of them. The other thing, of course, is financial knowledge, right? In places like Hong Kong, speaking of Hong Kong, the depth of financial knowledge is very strong, and therefore the intersection of sort of Web3 and fintech is natural for them. People already are interested in real estate. People are interested in investing as a whole. It's also an easy place to meet and connect versus a large country where everyone's spread out, for instance. For instance, the knowledge of financial knowledge in New York would be very high, for instance, right? So the Web3 knowledge and the interest in crypto, in US, for instance, would be concentrated around places like New York, unsurprisingly so. But from a nation perspective, New York cannot be compared to something like Pittsburgh or something like, Springfield somewhere else in whatever state. And that's basically why it's more diluted in that effect. And that's why there's so much more sort of disparity. So we think Asia is a very good place for that. And the rules and regulation that Hong Kong has put forward is also very, very progressive in terms of Web3 and crypto. You can do retail trading now, they're giving out licenses, and they see an opportunity to become not just a Web3 leader in the region, but actually in the world.
You mentioned your presence in Vancouver earlier. That caught my attention. We are, of course, Canada's first crypto media, Blockchain North. Any special message for Canada or any plans in Canada that you could share with us today?
Well, first of all, I mean, Canada has had quite an illustrious history when you think about sort of some of the early forms of crypto. And in fact, with NFTs, you know, CryptoKitties, what became Dapper Labs, they're basically a Vancouver company, also one of our portfolios, for instance. And so we think there's a lot of potential here in the space. I think Canada isn't necessarily a big country in terms of population, but it has a very...
Just reached 40 million.
Right. Not bad, right? But that's still less than France, for instance.
Right? Yeah, that's my country, actually.
Yeah, right? However, one of the wonderful things about Web3 is you don't need to have large population sizes, and the market is global. Right? And I actually think that one of the other things that I think has an advantage for Canadians is that Canadians are typically very freedom-loving folk. And that to me is one of the other key ingredients to understand Web3. The true nature of crypto, the true nature of blockchain and Web3 is about those freedoms, like economic freedoms, liberalism, digital property rights, or your rights to have them, is actually an important element. And it's not just about the money, right? But that's basically what I think creates a true ecosystem when you actually believe in that. And when you actually understand what Web3 truly stands for, then the adoption becomes much, much easier. So I think Canada has clearly some great potential there.
We'll be happy to hear this, of course. And where can people find you or read you or keep updated with your project?
I personally am most active probably on Twitter. The handle is YSIU. But other than that, Animoca Brands has a website, has a Medium blog. We also have different Twitter handles for Animoca where we basically launch our projects, so you can follow that. We also, have our subsidiaries like the Sandbox has a very active presence as well. So you can find us generally in many places. You'll find us also in other sub-pockets because of the fact that we have such diverse investments that there probably isn't a week that goes by that Animoca is involved in one activity or the other. So you'll probably find us in those channels as well, and also of course on YouTube.
Yes, and you're on LinkedIn as well.
That's right.
Yeah, it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you.